Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast. My name is Joey Schultz and I am joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. First up, his decks may not be all that well balanced in their colors, but they are definitely well balanced in their power level. That's Matt Morgan.
Joey, why can pirates never finish the alphabet?
Something about R?
No. Why'd you... The actual punchline is because they always get lost at sea.
Oh, dang it. Oh, I tried to outsmart the dad joke, but there is just never any outsmarting
the key is thinking
joke.
like a 6-year-old. That's how you come up with the best ones.
That explains so much, Matt.
It does.
I love it. I absolutely love it. All right, next, his decks are really well balanced in their colors, but they're definitely not balanced in their power level. That's Dana Roach.
By the time this show airs, Omnath will have been banned longer than it was legal. So I just wanted to throw that out there for anyone who is curious about how Standard's been going lately. But you can also go get your Omnath for Commander now, since presumably the price will have dropped to a reasonable amount.
That is the hope.
Oh. That is absolutely the hope. Oh, man. Anyway, this is the EDHRECast. EDHREC is the best deck building resource on the web for the Commander format, compiling data from deck lists all over the internet to provide helpful recommendations for new Commander decks. And here on the podcast, what we'd like to do is give all that data a little more context. Hey, Matt, what is it that we are talking about on this week's episode?
This week, we're going to talk about some commanders that maybe the colors are a little skewed. They're a little top heavy on certain colors that are in their identity.
Absolutely. This should be a whole lot of fun. The commanders where it's just like, yeah, it's a 2-color deck, right? No, turns out there's like 60 green cards and like 1 white card or something like that. We're going to be going through all of those. So color skewed or kind of color lopsided commanders. And you can look forward to next week when we talk about the more evenly distributed ones too. It should be a whole lot of fun. But of course, before we actually get to this really fun and exciting topic, guys, I am actually really excited to get to it. Before we get there, we have to give a huge thank you to the folks who help with all of the post-production on our show. That is Josh Lequai and the folks at the Command Zone, like Ashlyn Rose, Lady Danger, Mattson Lung. They do an excellent job. Thank you guys so much for all of the post-production work. It is so good, making it look as spiffy as it does. So thank you. And also thank you to our wonderful sponsors for the show too.
Yes, thank you very much for our sponsors, Card Kingdom and TCG Player. Card Kingdom has a fantastic buy list if you have unused cards you'd like to get rid of and use that store credit to pick up an Omnath Locus of Creation, for example, now that the price has dropped. We're also sponsored by TCG Player that has probably the deepest available inventory online. Just go to EDHREC and click on the card in question. In this case, Omnath Locus of Creation. Go to the link below it to the site you'd prefer. Doing so supports both us here on the cast and EDHREC as a whole.
Dana, I feel like you're really interested in that whole Omnath situation, aren't you?
Fascinating to me.
Fascinating.
Well, if you would like to not buy any Omnaths and you just want to support the show directly, you can do that as well. You can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast and you can join our patron page, which is an awesome place to do all sorts of different things. If you want to challenge some stats, we have a place for that. If you want to join our Discord, we also have a place for that. So patreon.com/EDHRECast, you can support the show directly. No Omnaths required. And if you don't want to spend any money, you don't forget, just like and subscribe to the channel, all of our videos. We appreciate that support. And that is absolutely free as well.
Yeah, and it's awesome. Really great community in the Discord there too. And there's also some other really cool perks going on. Like every time that we stream on Wednesdays, twitch.tv/EDHRECast, we also have a document that we're sort of recapping how the games went that folks can tune into if you're a member of the Patreon. We've also got a spreadsheet of all of our past challenges, the stats picks. It's a whole lot of fun. And then one other thing that we love to do, we love to shout out our listeners who are our patrons. So we shout out one patron per episode. This episode goes to Chris Slazinski. Thank you so much for being one of our patrons. We appreciate all the support that we get from all of you. It is so rad.
I went to high school with a Chris Slazinski, actually.
Do you think this could be the same person?
I didn't actually go to high school with a Chris Slazinski.
Well,
I also
there it
feel
is
like
then.
anyone who went to school with Matt probably isn't supporting the show at this point in time.
Probably not. Probably not.
Okay, the savage reads have begun. How about we get to our main topic so that can just be put to bed? All right, let's get to it. We are talking about those lopsided or color skewed commanders that weight very heavily towards one of their colors and not so heavily towards some of their others. And we've arranged a list of the top 10 commanders that fit this description. Basically, we're sort of just measuring the average data as we see, such as by taking the average deck list for the commander and examining how many cards there are of those different colors. So we should have some whole lot of really fun information there. but there are just a few caveats that we want to get to before we actually mention it. The first one is that we won't actually be counting anything from Zendikar Rising because at the time of the recording, it is still pretty fresh data, and we just want to give it a little bit more time to simmer, to, that way we can make sure that the numbers are right. More on that later on in the episode. And the final thing is that we won't be counting any commanders that have less than 100 decks, because we don't want to necessarily say, oh, this commander is really skewed when it has like only 12 decks to its name or something like that. It's kind of not a big enough sample size to measure, basically.
Yeah, that caveat has been in pretty much any of our data-heavy episodes. If there's not very much data, it's not really worth us ruminating on something when the sample size isn't big enough to make any valid conclusions anyway. So pretty much anytime we do any of these episodes, you can be assured if there's a command that has less than 100 decks, we're just not going to take into account for the purposes of that episode.
Right. But with that said, there are some very popular commanders here that we've found out about this particular data report that we're looking through. Very popular ones indeed that are very, very color skewed. So let's get to them. Dana, start us off. Who is our number 10 color skewed commander, lopsided color commander? Who we got?
Our number 10 commander here is Surrak Dragonclaw. That's the Temur Surrak 2 and Temur for a human warrior 6/6 with flash. Surrak Dragonclaw can't be countered, and creature spells you control also can't be countered. Other creatures you control have trample. So he's just a big stompy beater if you want to play green smashy stuff.
He is definitely very stompy. He's a bear punchy person in the lore, if I recall. Let's be real, Matt, I know that you love Selesnya, but Surrak Dragonclaw is honestly the type of character that I associate with you whenever you're playing Commander.
I have actually wrestled a bear once. That is not something I'm making up right now.
I don't know if I trust that.
Well, it was at the Build-A-Bear, and I'm not allowed to go back anymore.
Okay. All right. Well, there you go.
That's why he's not allowed back in the Build-A-Bear.
Man. All right, so let's get to some of the numbers on here. He is our number 10 most color lopsided commander because there are 60 cards in his average deck that have colored pips in their mana cost. And 51 of those 60 cards are green. 51 of them. So that means that there are only 9 non-green cards in a Surrak deck. There are also 16 blue cards among those 60 color cards and about 13 red cards on average. This is pretty insane. Only 9 non-green cards appear in an average Surrak Dragonclaw deck.
When I said Surrak does like green smashy stuff, I've literally meant green smashy stuff.
You really, really did. You absolutely did. There just aren't too many mono-colored blue cards or mono-colored red cards that appear on Surrak's page because it is mostly the big tromply things, basically.
Yeah, and this is taken into account multicolor cards. I know some people at home are thinking, oh, those numbers, those aren't lining up. The math doesn't make sense. We are counting multicolored cards. So a card might be green and red, for example. That's still going to count as a green card in the stats that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. But that also just kind of means that even the numbers that we just listed there, 16 of the 60 cards are blue and 13 of the 13 of the 60 cards are red. Most of the red cards are also green. Most of the blue cards are also green. Like, that's kind of how it's going. So that's how lopsided this really is. There just aren't too many mono blue or mono red cards that show up on the average Surrak data very often. The most popular ones that we see in blue, for example, are like Thrix the Sudden Storm, and then like Counterspell and Cyclonic Rift, which are just kind of staples and not necessarily unique to this commander. And Matt, what are we seeing for mono red cards that appear on Surrak's page?
I mean, for mono red, you have Terror of the Peaks, which is a fantastic new card that fits into the green, punchy, facey type of strategy Dana was hinting towards, just because it just deals so much damage when you're casting all these high power creatures as soon as they enter the battlefield. We also have some cards like Shaman of the Great Hunt, even though that activated ability, it does kind of lean into the green and blue a little bit, but it's also just very powerful creature. And then a Tali Primal Storm. It's a red staple. It's a very powerful card, and I'm not going to fault you if you can play it and you are playing it. It makes sense. So yeah, it's just playing some very good red staples that just happen to not be green in this instance.
Yeah, but the majority of the stuff that we see on this page is like Goreclaw and Beast Whisper and a whole bunch of other really classic green staples. So a very color skewed commander right here going on. But that was just number 10. How about we move on now to number 9? Matt, who we got?
Now we have Olivia Voldaren, the original Olivia, back from Innistrad days. She's 2 and a Rakdos color combination for a 3/3 legendary vampire with flying. You can pay 1 to ping a creature, and it becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, and put a +1/+1 counter on Olivia. And then you can pay 3 black, and you gain control of target vampire as long as you control Olivia. So lots of vampire tribal stuff going on there. There's 52 colored cards in the average deck, and 47 of those 52 are black. It's a very black heavy deck, and only 5 of them are non-black.
Man, that is so crazy. And that probably sounds really low, like only 52 cards with colored pips. But yeah, so that would be like, lands are also eating up at the negative space there, or like artifacts are also pretty prominent. Yeah, absolutely. But there are only 5 red cards is basically what we're seeing. There are actually 11 red cards total, but that would include like 6 red and black cards. So there are only 5 mono red cards in the average Olivia Voldaren deck. If you just scroll through her page, it's vampire after vampire after vampire after vampire, and the overwhelming majority of vampires definitely fall into the black slice of the color pie, basically, and very few of them.
And I believe I have some breaking news. Vampires tend to be in the color black when it comes to Magic the Gathering. I don't know if anybody's heard that before, but it tends to be true.
I mean, Innistrad was really the first set to at all dabble in the red space for vampires, and we've since had a second set that added a few more, but like there's 20 years of Magic prior to Innistrad and another, closing in on 10 at this point afterwards of mono black vampires. So like it's very understandable if you are building this deck as a vampire deck. The good cards just tend to be in black. It's really very similar to Surrak. If you are building a big stompy deck, the big stompy stuff tends to be in green. That's just how those things have always been over a lot of years.
Absolutely. Yeah, and of the things that we do see that are mono red cards on Olivia's page here, you've got like Rakish Air, which is a mono red vampire, and then there's Stensia Masquerade, which is a vampire enchantment that I'm not even personally too big of a fan of. And then after that, there's like Chaos Warp and Vandal Blast and Blasphemous Act. But aside from those 5 red cards, there aren't any other mono red cards above 30% popularity on Olivia Voldaren's page. That is very color skewed.
It's a mono black deck that's splashing red for utility, essentially.
I mean, basically, that's kind of how it feels, which you don't have to build it that way. That is just on average what we tend to see, which I think is really crazy.
And admittedly, if I was building that deck as a vampire tribal deck, that's probably how I would wind up building it, just because the cool vampires aren't black.
Yeah, no. And that's actually might not be the only time that we see vampires on this particular list, but more on that later. For now, we're going to move to number 8. Number 8, this one is Neith of the Dire Hunt, a more recent commander from Jumpstart. This is a 4-mana 3/3 human warrior that says whenever one or more creatures you control fight or become blocked, you draw a card. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can pay 3 mana, that's 2 generic, and then a Gruul hybrid. And if you do, you double target creature's power until end of turn, and that creature must be blocked this combat if able. So Neith is pretty interesting here, but we might end up repeating ourselves a little bit. There are 60 cards with colored pips in their mana cost in the average Neith deck, and 56 of those are green. So that leaves only room for 4 mono red cards in this particular deck. That is very, very small. There are 13 total cards that have red in her average deck, so a lot of green and red cards, but only 4 mono red cards in Neith's average deck.
And again, the most popular mono red cards tend to be things that are functioning as utility. Chaos Warp, Go for Blood, Silverclad Ferocidons, and Brash Taunter, I guess, are creatures, but like, again, it's very much using the utility effects here in red, and everything else is green.
Well, and Dana, you just named the 4 mono red cards that show up above 30% popularity on her page, and that's it.
Right. Yeah, that's it. It's those 4.
And after that, it's done. It's just those.
Yep.
Well, and when you look at all the fight spells that kind of play into Neith's ability, they're all going to be green. There's maybe a couple that are hybrid, for Gruul colors, for example.
Yeah.
But typically the prey upon, the all those, target creature fights another creature, those are all in green. So that's probably why, you're not seeing a bunch of mono red fight spells, because red just doesn't do that on its own.
Yeah, that's a really great observation.
Well, up next in the number 7 slot, Joey hinted at more vampire stuff to come. We have Edgar Markov, 3 red, white, black for legendary Vampire Knight. And Edgar has Eminence. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar's in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He also has First Strike and Haste, and when he attacks, you put a +1 counter on each vampire you control. So even more than Olivia, Edgar is very much encouraging you to run vampires. And looking at the stats we have here, 53 colored cards in the average deck, 44 of the 53 are black. So there's only 9 non-black cards in the deck.
Dang.
17 of the 53 are white, and 7 of the 53 are red.
Oh,
Well, and Dana, that point that you made about, going to Innistrad, they finally dabbled in red for vampires. It wasn't until Ixalan that they kind of dabbled in the white with vampires, so there's even smaller pool for white vampires that are going to fit into an Edgar Markov deck.
Yeah, we occasionally would get one in the Orzhov Guild, but we went from 3 white vampires to 15 with that set.
But it is kind of funny that we got some white vampires like in Ixalan, which came out way, way later. But at the same time, we are seeing white a little bit more often than we do see red in the average Edgar Markov deck. We've got some cards like Mavern Fane is one of its only really popular mono white vampires. I think there's also a Forerunner of the Legion, which is like a vampire tutor, not a vampiric tutor, a vampire tutor. So that shows up. But then aside from that, most of the white cards that we see, most of the mono white cards that we see on Edgar's page are, again, those staples like Swords to Plowshares, or, Edgar Markov had the Teferi's Protection come in the precon as well. So there's a lot of the role fillers in that category. So it is just kind of interesting to me that we have a bit more room for white in the deck than we do for red, because again, only 7 of the 53 cards have a red pip in their mana cost.
Well, and white traditionally does a really good job at supporting token strategies. So a lot of those white cards are probably going to be some sort of thing that's going to benefit you from playing white. You're a Cathar's Crusade that's going to make all those tokens Edgar Markov makes into very big tokens, or Anointed Procession we're seeing at a very large percentage because it's doubling the tokens. So I think that's why you're seeing more white cards than red cards when it comes to Edgar Markov specifically.
White also does a really good job with utility, removal in particular. So I think when you saw the Olivia deck, you saw some red removal like Chaos Warp that's been supplanted by the white removal that's a little bit better, like Swords to Plowshares or something.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And when we look at the red cards that appear on this list, it's Rakish Air and Styncia Masquerade again. And after that, there are no other red cards that appear above 30% popularity on Edgar Markov's page. No other mono red cards. Like, what?
Matt and I both had built this deck at one point in time, and at least in my version of it, I didn't have very much red. Was there much in yours, Matt?
Not a whole lot, no. There were a couple Madness Enablers, but that was about it. Not a whole lot going on. It was mostly black-white, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and I really can't say that I'm surprised, but it is also just kind of shocking to see the data just weighted so heavily to make it really, I don't know, it's just one of those things I'm like, I feel like I've got a decent feeling that might be the case, but this just hardcore confirms it for sure. All right, so that was number 7. Let's move on now to number 6. Matt, I think, this is a Selesnya one. It should be right up your alley.
It should be, and it is, because it is the friend to all the good boys. Tolsimir, friend to wolves, is that commander. It is 2 green, white for Legendary Elf Scout. When Tolsimir enters the battlefield, you create Voja, friend to elves, a legendary 3/3 green and white wolf creature token. And then whenever a wolf enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life, and that creature fights a creature you don't control.
58 of the cards in this deck are colored. 54 of the 58 are green. So of the 58 colored cards, only 4 are non-green. 11 of the 58 are white. So that's
4
ridiculous.
mono white cards.
Yeah.
4 mono white cards total for Tolsimir, friend to wolves. But that's just it. There aren't mono white wolves. There just aren't. If you're a wolf in the game of Magic, those are just classically going to be green cards. You've got way more of them in like the Night Pack stuff that Innistrad was always up to, as opposed to I can't think of what white has, like Tundra Wolves maybe.
Watch Wolf, I think, is one, but yeah, there's not many.
But that's just it. That's actually both colors. So again, it's just very, all of them are going to also be green, even if they are kind of in white. So yeah, we just don't see a whole lot for white here. There are a handful of cards like Rootborn Defenses is a kind of fun one that you see here. Mirror Entity, I will absolutely appreciate. We do have a decent popularity for that one on Tolsimir's page because it does also count as a wolf and it can pump up your army. I really like seeing that one. And another fun one here is the Wanderer, which can prevent the fighting damage that your wolves are doing to people. But that's kind of it. The well dries up pretty quickly after that one.
Yep, it's once again white as a utility.
Yeah, just being the best utility color. I mean, it stinks that you can't make more wolves with Tolsimir's ability just because the token is legendary, but all dogs are legendary because they're just great. So it's neither here nor there.
Fair point.
Win some.
Oh no. Well, but Matt, I don't want all dogs to be legendary because that means I won't be able to have a ton of them.
I mean, you can find some ways. I'm sure there's some sort of loophole you can jump through. But we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. That's for another time.
That's true. That's very true. Definitely for another time. And in fact, we've got more of these commanders we want to get to, but let's take a really brief pause and let's challenge some stats before we get to our top 5. This is one of our favorite segments on the podcast. We like to take a critical look at the data on EDHREC because we don't always agree with it. Sometimes I think the cards are seeing too much play. Sometimes I think they're not seeing enough play. So we'd like to challenge those stats here. I am going to start us off. Dana, I'm hoping to do you proud because I know that you love your obscure cards here. This is one that I don't even know if you've heard of. It's called Uba Mask. It is an artifact from Kamigawa. Do you know what this one does?
I do know what it is, Joey. An Uba Mask is what I use for snorkeling.
I think you mean a scuba mask?
I mean, I think they pronounce it differently depending on where you're at, so maybe that's what they call it in Seattle.
It is a regional dialect, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so Uba Mask is a very strange card. It's a 4-mana artifact that says if a player would draw a card, that player removes that card from the game face up instead, and each player may play cards they have removed from the game with Uba Mask this turn. This thing's bizarre, it's weird, but the ultimate point here is that it doesn't let people draw cards. It keeps them out of cards in their hand. And there's a commander from Jumpstart who probably really likes it when people don't get to have a lot of cards in their hand. That is Tiny Bones Trinket Thief, the 2-mana skeleton rogue that can draw cards when your opponents discard stuff. But the more interesting part is the 6-mana activated ability where each opponent loses 10 life if they have no cards in their hand. So after you've made them discard all the cards and you want to keep them with no cards in their hand, Uba Mask is a great way to make sure that even if they play some huge draw spell, they don't get to take proper advantage of it. This doesn't even show up on Tiny Bones' page at all yet. There are nearly 300 Tiny Bones decks, and I think that Uba Mask is one that you should really take a look at if you are playing Tiny Bones, because it keeps hands empty, so you can just keep on repeating that activated ability to just end your opponents. It's a whole lot of fun. Matt, I feel like you're giving me the stink eye because of how nasty this particular combo is.
No, but I can hear Josh and Jimmy over the command zone just shuddering so fiercely at the idea that you're encouraging people to play Tiny Bones. I don't think they're going to like that very much. Our editing might look a little spotty for this episode.
Oh no, I'm sure we'll just say that we're talking about a scuba mask instead of Uba Mask.
Scuba mask, yes, we're talking about deep sea fishing.
All right, Dana, what do you got?
The card I have here is a patron supporter suggested card brought to us by Mori Owlty, and the card is Martyr's Cause. It's 2 and a white for an enchantment, and the Oracle text reads: sacrifice a creature, and the next time a source of your choice would deal damage to any target this turn, prevent that damage. So I think this is a card we first used for a challenge of stats a year or two ago. It was definitely quite a while ago, but the numbers really haven't changed on it at all. And what's really useful about Martyr's Cause, in addition to just being a free sack outlet, which is fantastic in a whole bunch of different decks, is the source of your choice. It's not targeted. So it gets around Hexproof, gets around Shroud. You just pick the thing, sacrifice the creature, and prevent the damage. It's a really, really useful sack outlet that also has a really, really useful ability baked into it.
That is a really, really cool one. I see that Morialty points out that this is especially useful in their Kaikar deck because of all of the spirit tokens that you get. I mean, I prefer the Aristocrats versions myself, but Morialty, I'm glad that your fellow bird commander definitely makes great use of this one for sure.
And also, I loved you. You are such a good bad guy in Sherlock. Oh, that's Moriarty. Excuse me, my bad. Well, I still like the challenge. It's still a good challenge. It's still a good card.
The bird version of Sherlock, I would assume.
Yes.
Oh, There it is. Oh man. So yeah, I absolutely love that. And of course, Dana, you had to pick this one because it was an obscure enchantment from who knows when, right?
And I assume it's called actually Share Hawk in that case.
Okay, no, Matt, take it away. Take it away. We can't. Enough with the puns.
Okay, so I have a card. It's also a Jumpstart card that Joey's talking about, but it's going to be a card that you want to pair with the card. So in Allosaurus Shepherd decks, you obviously don't want any of your stuff to get countered because the card is all about, the spell itself can't be countered, green spells you control can't be countered, and those are two abilities that it seems a lot of people are keying in on. You can also activate the ability, turn all your creatures into 5/5 dinosaurs. Pretty cool, but people are spending more than enough money to buy a fetch land with it, a Scalding Tarn, $100 plus at cardkingdom.com/EDHREC, where you can pick one up if you really want. But there's another card that I think people are not playing enough of that gives some extra redundancy and also just a nice budget alternative too, is Rhythm of the Wild. It is 1 green and a red for an enchantment that says creature spells you control can't be countered, and then non-token creatures you control have Riot, which is when they enter the battlefield, you can either give them haste or a +1/+1 counter. So if you're spending all this money on an Allosaurus Shepherd, you're just trying to protect your creatures, having an enchantment version of that type of card is going to be very, very good and pretty valuable probably, considering you can't really kill enchantments near as easily as you can kill creatures. So it's just much, much harder to get rid of for your opponents. But it's also nice if you have to reestablish your battlefield. Say somebody casts the Wrath of God, blows up the entire battlefield. Rhythm of the Wild will stick around, but also you can give your creatures haste to then start attacking right away with. I think it's just a nice additional piece of redundancy for any deck that wants those, your spells can't be countered type of effects. And, when you consider it's, a 50th of the price, you really can't go wrong. Currently, only 27% of decks that are playing Allosaurus Shepherd are also playing Rhythm of the Wild. I think that number should be significantly higher.
Allosaurus Shepherd, I can't get over the price tag on this thing. So
it is a little silly, yes.
It's obnoxious. Wizards reprint, please. But I do like having other budget alternatives there too. Although I do think that the numbers might be influenced in some ways because Allosaurus Shepherd, as I understand it, may be used in some more competitive spheres. So be aware of that as well. But I mean, I prefer the budget version. That's just me.
Yeah, if you need a cheaper version just to replace it altogether, Rhythm of the Wild, you cannot really go wrong.
And one great thing about Rhythm, I'll just briefly mention too, because of the Riot effect, if you have another haste source out or someone is playing an authority to the consoles, so haste becomes meaningless, you can still then get some benefit from it by using the +1 counters portion of it. So it does stack really nicely too. Sometimes redundant haste effects aren't great because if you happen to have multiples, they don't do anything. Rhythm kind of works around that. It's a really, really good card. Definitely should get played more.
Alrighty, fun stuff, guys, but I want to get back to our main topic. Let's go to our top 5 most color-lopsided, color-skewed commanders. Our number 5 entrant will probably not surprise anyone. This is Omnath, Locus of the Royal, the 3-color teamer version of Omnath, before he went and got another color and then broke standard in half. This is the 4-mana teamer, 3/3 elemental. When it enters the battlefield, Omnath deals damage to any target equal to the number of elementals you control, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1 counter on target elemental you control, and if you control 8 or more lands, you draw a card. This is a really savage commander, all things considered. There are 59 cards with colored pips in their mana cost in the average Omnath deck, so a lot of room is being taken up by lands for sure. 49 of the 59 cards that have colors in their mana cost, 49 of them are green. So there are only 10 non-green cards in this 3-color deck, only 10 non-green cards. And a little bit worse, 15 of that 59, 15 of them are red, and 10 of them are blue. Which, you know what? At least red's not in last place this time.
Yeah, I guess that's something, but Moist Omnath, the most common mono-red cards here in our damp little buddy is Flamekin Harbinger, Smoke Braider, Incandescent Soulstoke, and Bright Hearth Banneret. Elementals. So we've got some red elementals here for our little wet friend.
Well, and the blue cards for Sognath.
Soggy Omnath,
excuse me. They ran together. But the blue cards in there also happen to be, they're also elementals. You have stuff like Mole Drifter, which is an elemental, Royal Elemental, another powerful card. But then you also have all those staples, Cyclonic Rift, Counterspell. all those kind of just blue, stick them in any deck running blue because you can. So it seems like, Moist Omnath wants to just protect himself a little bit and then play some more elementals.
Well, that's just it, actually. Like you mentioned, there might be like all those blue staple no, it actually kind of ends right there at Cyclonic Rift and Counterspell. We don't even have other blue counterspells. We don't even really have many other blue removal spells. Nothing else showing up in very substantial popularity here. So Omnath is just so heavily weighted towards green that even though there are some interesting cards that red and blue can offer, they just don't appear very much.
Yeah, there's just a lot of elementals here, and this deck doesn't have to be built as an elemental deck.
True.
So I'm kind of surprised they're that high.
That's actually very fair. You could totally build this as a not elemental tribal deck at all if you just wanted to go further in the landfall, which probably means that the colors get even more skewed after that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that was number 5. Matt, who is at number 4?
So number 4 is Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. She's 2 in Izzet colors. And whenever you cast a historic spell, you draw a card. That's it. That's the whole card. Nothing else to be said here. But of the cards in the actual 99 of the deck, 28 are colored, and it's very, very low, we know, but that's because most of the deck are artifacts that we found. Historic spells includes artifacts, the card type artifact, so there are a great deal of colorless cards in the average Joyra deck. But of the 28 cards that do have a color, 25 of them are blue, so only 5 mono red cards exist in the typical Joyra deck.
Only 3 mono red cards.
Excuse me, only 3. 5 red cards, 3 mono red.
Yeah, so that's the other so only 5 total red cards, which means there are 2 Izzet cards, 3 mono red cards, a lot of artifacts, and then a lot of blue cards. So artifacts have budged out red so much that it doesn't even get to really represent very much in this Joyra deck.
Well, in of the 2 mono red cards above 30%, Reckless Fireweaver and Deflecting Swat. Deflecting Swat is a really new card. It's entirely possible that we do this show a month or 2 ago, there's 1 red card on the list.
Yeah, absolutely. Just the Reckless Fireweaver, which I think does damage when artifacts enter, so it can be nice if Joyra is like comboing off, but red just doesn't, red's a really great artifact color, but Joyra is just so good at the blue things that she's like, I guess I don't need the red versions.
She's an independent woman, Joey. She doesn't need red holding her down.
There you go. I just feel bad for red. It hasn't had it always seems to be in last place. It might be a theme that we touch on as we're closing out the show. Anyway, let's move on to our final one. Matt, I just read what our number 3 lopsided commander here is, and I'm
a fan. I'm a fan.
This is one, I think you'd like it. I think this is one you really like. So let's throw it back to you. What is this number 3 commander?
Well, number 3 is probably my longest living commander deck, and that is Omnath, Locus of Rage. So he's the 7 mana red-green Omnath. He was only the second version. The first one not to dominate standard in any sort of way, so that is nice. That's credit to him. But he's pretty straightforward. Has a landfall ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, you create a 5/5 elemental token, and then whenever Omnath or another elemental that you control dies, you get to throw a lightning bolt at something. Whether it's a player, a planeswalker, or a creature, you just get to lightning bolt something. So in the average deck, there are 55 colored cards in there. 51 of them are green, so only 4 mono red cards.
Only four.
Only 4. That is a huge percentage. And as much as some of the New Zenda cards that we have coming out, those might skew the numbers a little bit. They might help average it out. I looked at my exact Omnath deck, and it's not too far off, actually, from the stats that we are seeing.
Yeah, there are 10 total red cards that show up, so that means that there are like 6 Gruul cards that are both colors, but only 4 mono red cards. That is just a very low showing, and it is also not the first time that Omnath has been on this list, nor indeed the landfall strategy. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Dana, of the mono red cards that we're seeing in the average deck, what ones do appear that actually give him any notable, any red presence in his deck?
So where Ancient's Tread and Warstorm Surge are the 2 that really jump out. 2 enchantments that deal damage to people based on creatures coming into play. So you're making a bunch of big, beefy elementals when you play lands, and those are then dealing damage to creatures. So those, of course, make complete sense in here. Then you have things like Goblin Bombardment to sacrifice those creatures to also do damage to people. totally logical. Blasphemous Act, just as a fantastic board wipe, that's also going to do a bunch of damage to people when all those elementals die. So it's all stuff that isn't surprising here at all. Terror of the Peaks, just a good card. And the one thing I want to really point out is Valakut Exploration is already showing up in this list, despite being legal in Commander like 200 hours or something. It's barely been out. So the notable point there is that's a really, really good card. And,
It's a very, very good card.
It's just really good. So,
But basically all the cards that you just listed there are just other ways of having Omnath deal a lot of damage. Like that is the function of red in this deck is damage, damage.
they're basically all extra arms for Omnath.
Yes, it turns out Omnath has like 17 arms, and it's just because he's so ancient and has been treading that where Ancients tread is just Omnath on another card.
Well, it's just so crazy because like there are really cool red cards. And in fact, I like all the ones that you just mentioned. But again, there's only 4 mono red cards in the average deck. So even the ones that you mentioned, not all of them tend to show up in the average deck together is the thing. It is a whole lot of landfall stuff going on. You've got your Avenger of Zendikars, you've got your Titanias, you've got your Rampaging Baloths, and then tons of green finding the lands, green finding the lands, green finding the lands is just so dominant on the page that it really pushes red not quite out of the equation, but it is just very, very heavily leaning towards one color way more than the other. But that was just our number 3. Dana, how about we get now to our number 2?
Our number 2 commander here is Tiana, Ship's Caretaker, which is a card I had kind of forgotten even existed. Tiana's 3 and Boros for a flying first strike angel, and whenever an aura or equipment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. So I think this is probably the least played card we here have in this list. It's only in 219, or it only heads 219 decks, but of those decks, they are very heavily skewed. There's 51 colored cards in her average deck, 48 are monocolored, and 3 are multicolored. And 46 of the 51 are white, leaving only 8 of 51 that are red. So there are only 5 mono red cards and 3 red and white cards in the deck.
That doesn't bode well for red once again.
It does not at all.
Yeah. Well, so, Matt, what mono red cards do we sometimes see on Tiana's page? I mean, it's a lot of mono white auras, which is definitely a specialty of white, actually. But what is red contributing?
Well, so red plays our Lord and Savior Valda, Keeper of the Flame, which is another one of my favorite commanders. So it's nice to see Tiana's, playing all the good stuff that I like. Valdek obviously benefits a lot from having all those auras on there and makes a bunch of elementals, but also happens to be from Dominaria. And we've seen in a lot of the types of cards and commanders that we've talked about, when cards are in the same set as a commander, typically they get a little boost there in the numbers. But we also see stuff like Champion of the Flame, which gets bigger the more auras that are on it. We also have some cards like Flamespeaker's Will, which is a nice little artifact removal spell that also happens to be something you recur with Tiana. So there's a lot of different kind of mono red auras that you see. Dragon Mantle come in, draw a card. So all sorts of different things like that seem to benefit from Tiana being able to recur them over and over again.
They are there. They are just not popular is the only problem.
Or great either.
Yeah, that would be another issue. Like the majority of her page is just so dominated by the Enchantress effects that you get that just aren't really necessarily in red's wheelhouse. So you've got your Mesa Enchantress, your Sage's Reverie, your Sigil of the Empty Throne, your Shram Senior Edificer. You've got all of those really, like, this is a specialty of white. We have certainly talked at length on so many podcasts, and so many other shows have too talked about like things that white isn't necessarily good at versus things that it is. This is definitely a specialty of whites. This is Enchantress stuff. This Voltron-y style is definitely a thing that it can really lean into, which I love seeing, but it comes at red's expense, and that makes me a little bit sad.
Yeah, unfortunately, in all of these commanders we're looking at, red comes up short every single time.
Every time.
And I'm a little surprised because I feel like red has gotten much better in Commander over the last few years, but I guess the way it's gotten better isn't in ways that support other colors, I guess. So people, it's gotten better, but it's not gotten better in a way that makes you run more red cards in your red-green deck or your red-white deck or something.
Yeah, that absolutely tracks for me. And I don't know, Dana, maybe I'll just go ahead and spoil it early. That pattern will continue for our number one commander. We are once again back at the landfall because the number one most color imbalanced commander from the data that we're seeing here is Lord Windgrace. This is the Jund Planeswalker commander. Starts with 5 loyalty. You can +2 to discard cards. You'll draw extra if you discard lands. You can -3 to get lands back from your graveyard, and he can -10 to destroy a bunch of stuff and make a whole bunch of cats. Really love this guy. Really fun for Jund Landfall, but doesn't even really count as Jund Landfall when it's basically just a Golgari deck and there aren't many red cards. The numbers show us that there are 55 total cards that have colored pips in their mana cost here. 48 of the 55 are green, so there are only 7 non-green cards in this 3-color deck. 13 out of those 55 are black cards, and 9 out of the 55 are red cards. So that maybe doesn't sound so bad, but again, all of the red cards are also green. Like almost all the black cards are also green. You've got stuff like Omnath in there, but that's also green. You've got stuff like Gidrog Monster in there, but again, it's also green. There just are not many like actual mono black or mono red cards. So maybe I spoke too soon when I said it was basically a Golgari deck. This commander is actually pushing out 2 colors in favor of green and not just 1.
Well, and I think a lot of the things that we said about the Teamer Omnath also applies here. You know, it's mainly green, a little bit of red, and then a splash of that 3rd color. I think that applies a lot here because all the best, land ramping spells happen to be green. So it makes a lot of sense why so many of these landfall or lands matter type of commanders also are leaning very heavily into the color that best provides that source of mana advantage. For sure. It's just so overwhelming. Matt, of the mono black cards that actually do appear on Lord Windgrace's page, what are we seeing? Well, of the mono black cards, only 3 are showing up above 30%. Not too many at all. But first up, we have Ob Nixilis, the creature. Obviously, when you're playing lots of lands, getting lots of landfall abilities, it's not too bad of a card to be running. We also have Retreat to Hagra and then Torment of Hailfire. So lots of life manipulation going on there. Anything that has black, you're not going to be surprised to see those types of cards. So black specialty in this deck is definitely making people lose the life. Yeah, you could say that for sure. Yeah, and then of the mono red cards that we've got, before Zendikar Rising gave us like the new Morale and Nahiri's Lithoforming and Dana's new favorite Valakut Exploration, the only popular mono red card that appeared on Lord Windgrace's page was from the precon, Nesting Dragon. Aside from that, like the only other card that was even above 20% inclusion on Windgrace's page was like Chain Reaction. Again, a card from the precon. So Zendikar Rising helped out a lot to help try and rebalance Lord Windgrace. But even then, he is so heavily skewed that he's still pushing out those 2 colors to make a very green landfall strategy for this ostensibly 3-color deck that really just favors 1 color.
Yeah, I mean, even the good red cards it got tend to do things that there's a green version of already, and decks only have so much room, so it gets really difficult in these decks to find slots sometimes, and when you're competing against green, that's a losing battle for every color, apparently.
Apparently. Well, that's just it. Like, that is kind of I think we've all had this sense that, like, green seems really good in Commander, and, like, there are plenty of ways that we can point at the evidence of it, but this is just one more piece to add to that pile, I think. Like, things really heavily skew in the case of some strategies and in some colors, and let's go through some of those now, too, actually. Like, I just think it was interesting to note the things that we lean towards. It's basically green down the entire line. Like, when we actually look towards all of these things weight towards green. And in fact, it took until entrant number 61 on this list, which happened to be Ural the Miststalker, before green was finally outweighed by another color. It still wasn't the least common color, though, because again, that's a Naya commander, and there was red in that one too, and there were only 5 red cards in a Ural the Miststalker deck. So even then, it wasn't last place. So going farther then, to find an actual place where green was the last placed color in one of its decks where it was skewed against green, that was entrant number 100, Edric, Spymaster of Trest. And that was because he had 19 green cards, but 45 blue cards. It took until number 100 for us to find a color where green was completely in last place. That's insane.
That's nuts. It is a little insane, but it's also insane to want to not play the best color. So,
Mr. Bias.
So, yeah, it's insane, but it's not surprising.
It's not surprising at all. No, and you have in Edric Spymaster Trest, you have all those evasive one-drop creatures that blue does fairly well. So, yeah, I guess we see why that's happening.
Well, I'm going to add some salt to the wound for folks who are a little sad about red. Unfortunately, it doesn't get much better for red because it isn't just these examples where red is biased against in a whole lot of cases. Things very consistently skew against red all down the list. It took us until entrant number 74 on this list, which happened to be Obosh the Prey Piercer, before red finally became the weightier color. And even then, it barely outmatched the black cards in an Obosh deck. So yeah, surprisingly, like I really enjoy playing red, actually. Like now that I've seen the new stuff that they're doing with red cards, I think they're really cool. But the data is still showing us that like the decks that play red don't play a lot of red is all.
Yeah, it's unfortunate if you are a fan of the color red, but it's the reality. It's just not represented very heavily in Commander for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But I do think that's getting better. Like we kind of hinted at a couple times today. Red has gotten significantly better over the past couple of years. Zendikar Rising gave red a lot of really good toys. I found myself cutting green card after green card after green card and replacing with a red card with my Omnath Locus of Rage deck. I do think things are getting better for red, but it's an uphill battle for sure.
Absolutely. And hey, you mentioned Zendikar Rising there. Earlier at the top of the show, we mentioned that we didn't count any of the Zendikar Rising commanders among any of this particular list, but let's play pretend. Let's imagine that we had. Matt, if we had included some of the Zendikar Rising commanders, how would they have fared on our list? What data would we have seen there? Would they be as lopsided here?
Well, somehow people are still getting copies of Omnath Locus of Creation, despite it, destroying standard, but it's banned now, so the numbers will only go up, right? I think so. But looking at Omnath Locus of Creation through this lens that we've been going through, we have 58 total cards that have one or more colors. 46 of them are green, 11 are blue, 8 are white, and then 6 are red. So it is just like every other commander that we've talked about. It's pretty heavily skewed towards the green color yet again.
And in this case, the way that we've actually drawn and balanced out against the number of colors that this thing is shoving aside, Omnath would have been number one if we had counted Zendikar Rising commanders, because it is so green. Like there's only 12 non-green cards. There's so much green that it's outbalancing 3 other colors in that deck. That is not an even distribution, like at all.
Not at all.
All right, so it doesn't stop there, because Dana, who would have been number 4 on the list if we had included Zendikar Rising commanders?
If we would have counted Zendikar Rising, we would have also had Phylath at number 4 with 58 total cards of color, 52 being green and only 10 are red. We would have had Oboon at number 8 with 43 green cards compared to 15 white and 7 red there as well.
Oh, man. So basically what we're saying is that Landfall, this is obvious to everyone, I'm sure, but Landfall is definitively the most color-imbalanced strategy that you can possibly have, y'all.
Landfall is very popular, and it very heavily skews green. So, yeah, that's the big takeaway here for sure.
Yeah, well, and that's just it. We didn't count these because we do want to give time for the data to, simmer and actually sort of correct itself, maybe, but I also don't think that this is the kind of thing that's going to change. I don't see this skew changing at all over time.
Probably not.
Basic Forest, OP, man.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there's some fun stuff that we can finish out with on this. We just went through the top 10, but there's some other stuff that I think might be fun to throw in here too. The most lopsided 5-color commander that we could see on this list was, can you guys guess it? Can you guess what it would be?
I'm gonna guess Golos because
it's landfall.
Yeah, he's landfall heavy, so Golos probably is up there.
That is a very educated guess, and it was my guess as well because it has a strong tendency toward landfall, but it is actually beaten out by the screaming baby child of Alara. And it's actually not as skewed as I thought it might be. There are 32 cards that are green. Again, it skews towards green to help color fix for all the 5 colors. And it goes down, there's like 13 blue, and it goes down to only 6 red once again. So even in this case, a 5-color deck. And then aside from Omnath, the most lopsided 4-color commander would have been Berea, because there are 26 blue cards, but again, only 8 red cards and only like 9 black cards and like 11 white cards.
And no green.
You know what? That's true.
There's
no green
right
for Berea.
there.
So yeah, that's just kind of interesting. Like as we're looking through these landfall and then in fact artifacts, as we're looking through these, those tend to be pretty skewed. Landfall obviously towards green, but we also had like 3 different artifact commanders among the top 50. So that is another type of strategy that is also very color skewed, in this case towards red. In this case, towards blue. Sorry, I just really wanted red to have something, but it doesn't get that. It was in this case towards blue because we had stuff like Sidri appeared there, Brea appeared there, so it is very weighted in that case too. So landfall definitely takes the cake, but other strategies can also totally lean towards that. And it isn't just strategies either. Like Matt, I'm sure that you noticed there are some tribes also that definitely appear to skew towards one color way more than the other.
Yeah, well, like Dana said earlier, vampires for a very long time were mono black throughout the history of the game. It wasn't until Innistrad that they started getting a red splash, and Ixalan that they got a white splash. So those typically are going to be, heavy and very, very, very reliant on the black color. Zombies are going to be the same way. They have 4 in the top 50, 4 commanders in the top 50 are going to be that zombie tribal really leaning into black. Wizards, they tend to be blue, if you didn't know and you hadn't been playing Magic for the past 20 years. But they also put 2 commanders into the top 50 just for being blue and reliant. But you also have elves. I would dare you to find an elf deck that doesn't play a lot of green cards. So yeah, the tribes typically have that one color that they start from, and they kind of season out and branch out, as the game has evolved from there.
Yeah, like you mentioned, we saw a whole lot of zombies among, when we were looking through this lens, a whole lot of vampires, a whole lot of wizards as well. But then it also just totally makes sense for a bunch of other tribes too, because I want to find a deck where elves are not the most popular in the green. Like, I don't know if I can do it, but Matt, I'm accepting your challenge.
Good luck, man. Good luck.
So this is all very interesting data, but it's more than just interesting. I think it's actually pretty relevant in quite a few situations. The first one that comes to mind here is cards like Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, that care about the devotion you have to a certain color. I feel like it usually isn't something you want to play in a 3-color deck because it's so difficult to hit that devotion in a way that's meaningful. Unless you're playing one of these commanders that skews ridiculously towards one direction, in which case you may well have more pips in that deck that's 3 colors than some decks do that are 2 colors, just because of how the balance is towards, let's face it, green most of the time. So this data does wind up being very relevant in how you brew, whether it's, cards like Nykthos being impactful, cards like Grey Merchant, the land base and the land spread you're going to run in terms of like what colors you're going to generate. A lot of this really does matter for these decks, and for a lot of decks, even if your deck isn't so heavily skewed to one direction, it still probably has a skew, and you still should probably look at that and try to figure out if you need to balance things appropriately.
And a good point to kind of build off of that is we talked a lot about landfall decks being very, very heavily invested into the green color, but that's because you have so many staples like Nature's Lore, Cultivate, Kadama's Reach, all those spells, but they're not permanents on the battlefield. Right. So they're not going to be sticking around for you to get mana off Nykthos, like, Dana, you were kind of hinting at just there. So yeah, I like that point that, yes, the deck may be skewed with the spells, but are the permanents skewing towards a certain color as well? And that's a very, very important factor that I hadn't really kind of thought of that until now, but I like that point. So yeah, that's a really good thing that I think a lot of listeners could benefit from, just keeping that in the back of their mind. Well,
not only that, but if you're playing against one of these decks, name green if you've got protection from a color, apparently.
Right.
Like if you see Lord Windgrace and you've got protection from green, it's going to be way better than if you had protection from red, because they don't have a whole lot of red presence in that deck.
Yeah, good point.
And this, I really love, especially with attention to your mana base. This is a whole lot of fun to go over all of these lopsided color skewed commanders, but this is part 1 of 2. We do have a more even distribution episode coming down the line. We'll take a look at the commanders where the colors are actually sharing a whole lot of the load and not just one color is shoving away the other color and only one is doing all of the work. So it should be a whole lot of fun. Stay tuned for next week. But for now, guys, this was just awesome. I really loved this particular topic. Thanks so much for joining me. And let's call this episode to a close. If our listeners want to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find you all? Matt?
You can find me on the Twitters at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. You can also catch us Wednesday evenings streaming games, twitch.tv/EDHRECast. Make sure you tune in because we're having a blast every single week, and it would be a shame to miss it because, well, Joey doesn't always win, just usually wins.
Oh, that's not even true. You guys destroy my graveyard and then I'm completely helpless. Anyway, how about you, Dana?
You can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can hear me on my other podcast, CMDR Central. And you can find all of us on patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter. You can find the cast at EDHRECast on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you have a question, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks once again to Josh Lee Kwai and the entire team at the Command Zone for handling the post-production work on the podcast. And of course, our thanks to our sponsors. They are TCG Player and CardKingdom.com. You can find them using the price info links on EDHREC or by visiting CardKingdom.com/EDHREC, and that shows your support for the show. We will be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.